This is the DRS train.
Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. This service is 2008, the Santander saga. I'm your driver, Peter Brook, and your conductors today are Ciaron Smith and returning guest DanNoSkill. Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning there, Peter. Happy to be back with yourself, and great to meet Dan as well.
Yeah, good morning, guys. Good to be back on and see you both here today.
So today we have the second of what is basically becoming a three-part series covering 2008. So last week, me and Ciaron were looking at basically Felipe Massa's title challenge within the context of his attempted lawsuit to try and overturn the Singapore race, which basically ended up turning into 2 hours of us just ripping into Massa and explaining why he shouldn't get that title. One subject that kept coming up that we were deliberately trying to avoid talking about was Kimi Raikkonen, and the scandal that basically involved an alleged sabotage against him by Ferrari as an attempt to try and get him out of the seat to bring in Santander and Fernando Alonso. So this is an interesting one because it's not something I was at all aware of at the time and only discovered when I had to put it in my own iceberg video a year ago. But it's not even something like it's actually quite well documented compared to most other things that would be considered conspiracy theories, and it's not even something Kimi talks about. But it does make a lot of sense when you start to look.
It really does, and I think it goes hand in hand with F1 being very much, yes, a sport on merit, but also a sport heavily driven by corporate interests, financial interests, and politics that go along with that. And I think, as you mentioned there, Peter, the educated, the very discerning viewer of Formula One can probably put together the pieces we're about to present and come to the conclusion that, in fact, Raikkonen was likely disadvantaged, even sabotaged by his team for political and business/commercial reasons. And what a shame, because I do think it cost Ferrari a title.
So to give this a bit of context, so 2007, Ferrari has a new lineup because Schumacher has retired. Raikkonen gets the seat alongside Felipe Massa. It's Raikkonen that ends up taking the title very narrowly, but mostly because of the Spygate scandal involving Ferrari and the general rivalry between Alonso and Lewis. Alonso goes back to Renault for 2008. Massa stays on with Raikkonen in 2007 because at this point Michael Schumacher makes his retirement permanent, or at least permanent in the sense that he'll only come back in 3 years' time, not immediately. But yeah, so going into 2008, it's Raikkonen. Well, he's the man to beat as the defending champion, and the season starts relatively strongly. There's not much that seems out of place at all, but it's obvious that it's going to be a very close fight with his teammate and against Lewis Hamilton at McLaren.
Absolutely, and I just want to quickly jump in and say that even before the season started, we had recently seen some quotes by Gino Rosado, who was a Ferrari insider. He was always the bloke who was holding like Michael Schumacher or Kimi Raikkonen post-race, where even before 2008 started, apparently Ferrari had made some kind of a deal with Alonso for pertaining to giving him a race seat at some point in the future, should he cooperate with the Spygate scandal, which of course stripped McLaren of their constructor points, effectively handed the constructor's title to Ferrari. So already there's a lot of backdrop, even, day one of 2008. And, that only continued as the season went on.
Yeah, it's important to note 2007, isn't it? Because you've had the main players of Raikkonen and Alonso, and I suppose Hamilton, and they're going to carry on over into 2008, you'd think. Obviously not Alonso race-wise being in the midfield Renault instead of being in a front-running car, but that's all to do with the McLaren stuff. But you'd think that Hamilton and Raikkonen should be two drivers fighting at the front again, given how close Ferrari and McLaren have been over probably the past, at this point, 5-6 years in F1?
It certainly begins that way because, as I mentioned, the first the first few races, I mean, they were a bit topsy-turvy because there were things, both teams were making mistakes, both on driver and team fronts. And obviously we covered this in a lot of detail in the last episode from the perspective of Massa and Hamilton. But Raikkonen started kind of fairly strongly and got a couple of wins, and then it started going off the rails. But also, yes, so it was a change of management for Ferrari as well, because by this point they'd kind of lost most of the Schumacher's dream team that he had for the past 11, 12 years. Because Jean Todt is gone. He's going to become FIA president over Max Mosley eventually, but Stefano Domenicali is now their new team principal. Schumacher is made third driver, but he's not really there as a reserve. He's more just doing a lot of testing at Fiorano and development behind the scenes. It's definitely a transitional period when they start to sort of lose the Schumacher influence.
Rob Smedley, who was Felipe Massa's engineer, recently said in an interview that 2008 Ferrari team, really 07, but especially 08 and 09, was in his mind the worst Ferrari team operationally that he had ever been a part of, which struck me because they were competitive. But he just said everything from, developing the car, strategies, team coordination. He recently said it was the worst team he was ever a part of, which I found interesting as well, kind of to your point that the transition had truly begun.
And does that fall into the fact that there'd been that huge power struggle at Ferrari between Jean Todt and Di Montezemolo sort of at the end of 2007 and then going into the 2008 season? Because those two essentially had, I wouldn't say a falling out, but a fight for who was going to take Ferrari in the right direction, or the direction that they saw best. And that's why Domenicali got brought in as the team boss. Less because Todd wanted to leave and more because he was sort of forced out.
Absolutely right, Dan. And what I will say to that is that was just a continuation in my books of 2000 and what was really going on since 2005. Because remember, the reason they Montezemolo signed Kimi was precisely because he wanted something to shake up the Michael Schumacher, Jean Todt, Ross Brawn axis. And it's just so ironic because it ended up being that Kimi didn't really get along with Montezemolo. But that's what he did. And Ross Brawn was not promoted, thus he left and took a better job at Honda. Jean Todt was never going to be promoted because Luca de Montezemolo saw him as a threat to his position. And subsequently, people like Paolo Martinelli, like the engine chief, and Rory Byrne were either given lesser roles or, in Martinelli's case, upgraded to an executive position in the team, no longer at the race weekends. So, that was really like the final nail in the coffin for that old dream team, as you guys mentioned. So, yeah, this was really the beginning of to me, 2008 was the true beginning of a new era for Ferrari, because none of the dream team was really there that year on the pit wall as they were in 2007. And boy, was that a messy year. We could tell. We could tell that wasn't the dream team that year. That was not what you would have expected from Ferrari.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose they did win the constructors in 2008, but that was their last title success of any. And since then, yeah, it's been very up and down, and you can sort of see the effect of not having Schumacher and the Dream Team's influence, and you can kind of understand why they were so successful, because it's just been varying degrees of messiness in the 16 years since then. But the thing that kind of got all of this in motion was that Santander were planning to enter the stock market in Brazil by putting down an initial public offering. I don't know what that is, but I put it in my video because that's what I'm told it was that they'd done. And you can see the obvious incentive there is that, okay, well, this is Brazil. Massa's from Brazil. Wouldn't it look nice to have a Brazilian champion who's, promoting Santander for us on the stock market.
100%, Peter. And you know, when someone does an IPO, they're basically selling shares, initial shares of their company to the public. But it's not a secondary offering in that it's not shareholder to shareholder, it's from the company to the market. So a company that was not listed would do an IPO, sell its shares to public shareholders in an offering. It would hire a bank to help it with that, and then the company would be public with shareholders. But you know, rumors started early on that Santander wanted to join, and we can touch on this later, but they wanted to leave McLaren, who they were sponsoring at the time, and join Ferrari as early as 2009. And it would have been the perfect setup for their IPO, which was planned for 2009, to have a Brazilian world champion and go public on the largest stock exchange in Brazil. That is it's exactly what you would want if you were Santander. You know, you have national pride of Brazil, you have a bank that would be sponsoring the winning team with a Brazilian world champion. That would probably lead to an oversubscribed initial public offering. Everybody gets rich. What's not to like? Well, I'll tell you what's not to like. Kimi Raikkonen gets absolutely shafted in the process. But we can get to that later. But that's really some of the context that was already rumored early in 2008.
So yeah, let's get going then with how the season began. So initially it was fairly harmless, I suppose, for Kimi. I mean, the first race he had an engine failure late on, but he was running. He still managed to score a point because there were so few finishes in what was a very chaotic race for everybody. Because this was the main technical change that year was the banning of traction control, launch control, and engine braking, which that everyone had been used to for several years now. So that meant there were a lot of accidents and a lot of errors. I mean, obviously Massa himself, he crashed into Vettel at the start of the race, and then he crashed into Coulthard later on, and then his engine blew, so he got nothing. Whereas Hamilton took a very comfortable win. So it was kind of clear things were already not getting off to a particularly good start for Ferrari.
Not sure what on earth was going on in that first race. I think there's always funny racing in Australia, to be frank. It was never a good indicator of what was going to happen over the course of a season. But as you guys mentioned, look, Australia was a one-off, and then Ferrari bounced back very strongly in Malaysia with a dominant win by Kimi. Massa followed that up in Bahrain as well. So, to be frank, they didn't score the maximum available points, I think, for the performance of their car, but things weren't terrible. Let's put it that way.
No, things for the start of the season were actually running reasonably smoothly in comparison for what was to come. I think you could say that the drivers were both just focused on driving to their top level. I don't think the team at this point were clear on what they were going to do regarding anything Santander-wise. It was probably still all in its early days. So for the moment, things do go smoothly. Lewis Hamilton, like it says here on the slide, is leading the World Championship, but by barely anything from Kimi. And that's after 2 races. So there's still plenty of room to go and a massive season ahead. So yeah, things, I would say for Kimi and Ferrari at this point, things do look optimistic. We might touch on this later, but there's a race in Spain to come where I think that's really like the last good moment Kimi has for the season. And from there, it all sort of goes downhill, but we'll get into that.
Yeah, I actually missed these 2 races because in the last episode I gave a brief account of how I got into Formula One, and it was 2008 I started watching it full time from Bahrain onwards. But these 2, so I never saw them live, even though both of them were fairly chaotic. All I remember the Australia one was somebody made a highlight reel of it on YouTube, and they as the background music they'd used the song "Everybody's Fool" by Evanescence. And so that always became my like F1 song, just because watching all these cars crashing to Evanescence. Oh, wow. But yeah, that and Malaysia, I didn't watch them live. I've rewatched them since because I've had to for research for videos I've made. But yeah, Malaysia, this one. So Kimi won it. I think he started the race in second behind Massa, but then he passed him in the pit lane. And then Massa spun off by himself. And Kimi gets the win. And Hamilton had a grid penalty for blocking Nick Heidfeld in qualifying. And I think he may have got another penalty in the race. So he finished fourth or fifth. So after two races, it's then swung in Kimi's favor.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have your customary Massa boring win in Bahrain, where Massa only wins if he starts from first or second. So he did his job. Kimi finished P2. And then we get to Barcelona, where Kimi, keep in mind, Kimi wasn't fully happy with the car this season, even at this point. But, you felt like in Barcelona they were making progress because Kimi got a great pole and he dominated the race easily. He was really cruising the entire race, managing the gap to Massa. And he has a quote after that race where he says, we were going really fast all the time and we didn't have the slightest problem in the race. Many times I have won and afterwards still had the feeling that it could have gone better. This is one of the few times I did not have that feeling. This was probably the best weekend I've ever had in my career. Those were Kimi's words after Spain 2008. And then only a few days later, we get some absurd articles coming out from absolutely nowhere with Luca de Montezemolo saying Massa's future is secure with the team, but I think it's too damaging to partner Alonso with Kimi, which prompted Keke Rosberg to say Kimi might have to make way for Alonso, and Domenicali randomly saying, I don't think Kimi's considering retiring. Where on earth would they have gotten that idea from? And that's when something really was brewing behind the scenes. And it's really at this point when Ferrari, I believe, had begun negotiations with Santander. And I think we're trying to prepare the public's mind for what they were trying to do, which was to effectively phase out Kimi Raikkonen at some point. But this was the beginning of that.
I don't think it was. I don't think it was an accident that this was happening after Spain, which of course home race for Alonso and Santander. They probably weren't necessarily expecting Kimi to win that and to do it so comfortably as well. Because Alonso himself, he had an engine failure in that race. I think he was running in third or second or third, and then his engine blew in the middle of the race as well. So yeah, it really wasn't what they wanted.
It's interesting as well. Sorry. But
no,
yeah,
Dan, go ahead.
All right, thank you. It's really interesting as well because when you look at it, a lot of people, I've seen this rhetoric online before. I assume from people who are probably more similar to my age. I was like 4 when the season was actually happening, so I don't remember much of it live. But going back and looking at F1, I think a lot of people just write this off as, classic Raikkonen, he won the championship and then he has a year of just having a hangover or something for people that don't know the story. But then you look at that quote and how he felt after Barcelona, and basically he was on his top level of driving. He felt like he was pretty much perfecting the skills he'd been honing over his past 5, 6, 7 years in F1, which is absolutely incredible. And then it does make you wonder, if there hadn't have been all this politics, money, everything going on behind the scenes at Ferrari, if Kimi had been purely focused on driving and the car and how motivated he was, I think, like you said, this probably should have been an easy world title for Ferrari.
Well said. I completely agree with that, because what happened was not only did Kimi start to second guess himself and the team, which he's admitted to second guessing himself that season, the development went completely away from him in a way I've rarely seen inside of a team. We'll get to that later. I think this will lead us to the next month, because already there were some, not only what I just mentioned before, but there were just some crazy quotes coming out of the blue. And guys, let's remember, Kimi has just won 2 of the last 4 races. Actually, he's won 3 out of the last 5, if you can. Actually, he's won 4 out of the last 6, if you count from China 2007 to Spain 2008. I know I'm cherry picking there, but he's won half of the season races so far in 2008. He's done absolutely a magnificent job. So then Niki Lauda comes out with a quote and says, "Last year Raikkonen was world champion. Why are we discussing whether Alonso has to go there? Why should this happen?" And that pretty much echoes every single person's sentiment. Like, where are these rumors coming from? Why would you be spreading these rumors when you have a top performing driver and the reigning world champion? And finally, when we got to Monaco, which was in May, there were some even crazier rumors that Alonso had already signed a deal for 2010, and the Spanish media rumors were in overdrive. I mean, at this point, you have to ask yourself, what on earth is going on? I mean, why have they signed Alonso to a contract in 2010 when, as Lauda said, nothing is going wrong with the team? They have a harmonious team. They have a top driver. There's obviously an ulterior, perhaps commercial motive. And that's where the Santander link comes in. I'm not sure if you guys have anything to add on that point.
Yeah, because, well, yeah. So like you said, in Monaco, there's all this Spanish media, and they start basically spreading these rumors about Alonso already having signed the deal. At this point, with Kimi still leading the championship, which is just insane to think, like you said, Ciaron. But then with the Santander deal, so we'd already seen, the whole point was, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what I read when I was doing research for my video on this as well. Santander signed with McLaren because they would have Alonso. And for those who don't know, Santander is Spanish, Alonso Spanish. So there's the tie in there. That's why they want a Spanish driver representing them. Similar to what people have said, because Ferrari still has a Santander sponsorship with Carlos Sainz now. Obviously, Sainz is leaving in like a year, but he was also backed a little bit by Santander, similar to how it was with Alonso. But with Alonso and McLaren falling out over the season before, he's with Renault, and now Santander go, well, we don't really have a point to be sponsoring McLaren. It doesn't align with our values. So that's why all these rumors of them wanting to go to Ferrari, have a Brazilian and a Spanish driver, it completely aligns with everything they're trying to do business-wise. And we're not talking like, oh, this will help increase the stock share by 0.01%. This is worth billions in marketing to them. So that's why it's such a big deal, because it's a huge amount of money that's being played with here.
That's a mega point. And it really is billions of dollars. And I just want to, that was really well said, Dan. And I just want to add just a few pieces of color to that. Santander is not just a bank. Santander is the equivalent of like a JP Morgan, a Barclays, a Goldman Sachs in Spain. It's like the bank in Spain by market capitalization. So, just think about, what that means for the Spanish angle for Santander to have a Spanish driver, the Brazilian angle to have a Brazilian driver when they're planning an IPO, as we mentioned earlier in this podcast. As you said, this just completely aligns with their strategy, and it makes perfect sense from a financial point of view. The real question is, did it make sense from a strategic point of view, given they had Kimi Raikkonen? And were they, in fact, throwing away a title with all this drama? And we'll get to that as well, because if we wrap up May quickly here, Monaco was a messy race. Hamilton wins, Raikkonen retired, Massa third. Turkey was Massa's usual, stomping ground. And then at the end of the day, those rumors of Alonso going to Ferrari basically happened at the end of May. Before we get into June and July, there's another piece of the story we need to mention. And that's that, Kimi was basically caught up in this little bit of a triangle between him, Massa, and Michael Schumacher, in that Michael Schumacher was not just the third driver, as Peter mentioned earlier. he was the test and development driver, and he very much was leading car development, rightly or wrongly, for the team. So, it's at this point that we really start to see as the season goes on, Michael Schumacher almost dictating car development for the team, which he has admitted to at the end of the season, and in whether implicitly or just through wrong decisions, those car developments very much began to suit Massa over Kimi. But that happened a little bit later. So, moving on from May, I think we can move on to July here, unless anything. Sorry, moving on to June here, unless you guys have anything else to add.
Only I suppose that Monaco, that's where the cracks start to get in, because that's where, for Kimi at least, things do start going wrong, because we mentioned obviously there was that suspicious penalty, but then also him crashing into Satil, and it's like this, and it's just this is kind of the beginning, where before that everything had been from his driving, there'd been no problems, and this was where the mistakes started to set in, and it coincides with when these rumors and all this media speculation came as well.
Absolutely. It was a very strange penalty. Kimi got a 10-second stop-go penalty because of Ferrari's operational error in putting on the tires. And that put him into the pack where he just shouldn't have been in the first place. That was just the beginning. That was an awful race for Kimi. But he was still close in the title fight. It wasn't like it wasn't salvageable at that point. I think it's odd because the next race was Canada, and before that race, Kimi had to clarify that he had a contract up until the end of 2009. And you'll basically see if he wants to continue after that. My question is, okay, Kimi had a bad race in Monaco. Why are we talking about his contract? Again, he's still in the hunt for the world title. He still won 2 races that season. What's going on? Why is this some kind of topic of discussion after one race? And, I think that just tells you all you need to know. And, unless we have something to say about Canada here, Canada was a mess. Kimi would have probably won that race, in my opinion, but he got rear-ended in the pit lane when he pitted at the same time. Obviously, they all came in, right? Because if I'm not mistaken, there was a safety car. Kimi, Hamilton, and Kubica all pitted at the same time. Kimi came out in front of Hamilton, basically, just a little bit in front, side by side with Kubica. And then Hamilton didn't see the red light and crashed into the back of Kimi. That was also another piece of bad luck for Raikkonen there.
I mean, I can't even think why they would have closed the pit lane, because I'm pretty certain the safety car was Adrian Satil pulling over around turn 4, turn 5.
Yeah.
But they did this again, this was quite a critical thing. In Singapore, they closed the pit lane again, and there were several drivers that ended up getting penalties because they had to pit, otherwise they'd run out of fuel. So they just had this bizarre rule at the time that if there's a safety car, let's just close the pit lane. But then they closed it after they'd come in. It was just very odd, because these days that very rarely happens unless someone has crashed on the pit lane entry or exit.
Yeah, I think from what I heard, and I read some comments about this, because again, I looked up at this crash. I'm pretty sure it was just a weird thing with Canada where they would put the red light on during the safety cars sometimes, because they were letting the cars go past the pits, and then they wanted them to join at the back or something weird like that. But anyway, the red light's on, and you just see Hamilton absolutely bomb it down. And then, of course, he hits out, the guy who's more of a threat to him in the title than the other car that he could have also rear-ended. So that's just luck, if you would call it that.
That was not a good moment for Lewis. It was a very avoidable mistake, and Kimi wasn't too happy about it, was he? He pointed to the light after the incident, almost in a mocking way, to say to Lewis, "That's all you got to do is look at that color there." And if I'm not mistaken, Nico Rosberg felt like he wanted to get involved in the action too, and crashed into the back of Hamilton after Lewis had hit Kimi. So Not really sure what Nico was thinking. I mean, maybe he just got jealous that everybody was having fun without him, and he just wanted to join the action. I'm not quite sure what his excuse was for doing that, but
Yeah.
it was a wild race that gave Kubica his first win without being too disparaging to Robert.
Yeah. I
Because he
mean,
had no competition.
Kubica was in the pit lane as well. He was there too because he braked at the same time as Lewis, but he went to the right and Lewis went to the left and hit Kimi. And then Rosberg, he did hit Lewis. He very much lighter, so he probably reacted faster, but still not fast enough. But he still damaged his front wing, but it wasn't a race-ending collision. He just had to pit again. But yeah, if Hamilton had gone to the right, he could have won, but Kubica ended up winning it because he went to the right and didn't hit anybody. And Massa had his own pit lane problems, which meant he didn't even win it, and he finished. Yeah, just a very topsy turvy race from everybody. But then we had in France, it looked as if maybe things were coming back to Kimi because he got pole, but then his exhaust broke in the middle of the race, which gave Massa the win. And this again was a race where they had needed to capitalize because Hamilton had a penalty for his collision from Canada, and then he got another penalty for cutting corners on the first lap, and so he finished outside the points. But this was just a mechanical, well, unless you want to call it sabotage, just a mechanical problem that took the win away from Kimi.
It's just shocking how many points Kimi could have had in those two races in Canada and France, and ended up really only getting points when he probably should have gotten 20 points, if I'm honest. And at the time, you would still think that it's an honest mistake, but some of the things that happened in July in the media, make you really ponder what was going on. Because, yes, Massa won that race by luck, because there's no way he would have beaten Kimi without that exhaust failure. But it put Massa in a great position in the World Championship, further consolidated Kimi's misfortune that year, because he was having a lot of misfortune. And if we move out of June and we move into July, there's something very important that everyone should note that happened in the media. And that is that there was an article that came out in several reputable news outlets, one of them being Sport Bild, which is one of Germany's main outlets. And this confirmed that Santander would be moving from McLaren to Ferrari from 2009 already. So then basically this would align with Ferrari's commercial interests, as we all mentioned earlier. And the main condition of this going through was that Alonso would have to drive for the team. And Alonso then came out and said that he wasn't going to confirm his future or comment until the month of September. Now, this is interesting. Why did Alonso pick the month of September? How on earth does that make any sense? Are you just picking a random month, mate? No, he's not picking a random month. You see, what had happened here is that he already had signed this deal, in my opinion, and most people's opinion, between himself, Ferrari, and Santander. But Kimi was still negotiating with Santander. So if you think about it, if you look at Kimi's contract details, which were basically and the desired sponsorship date, quite obvious that Alonso knew that Kimi's performance renewal option was in September, and he was waiting to see if Ferrari would exercise it. So Alonso already knew what was in Kimi's contract, and he was basically, I think it was a tactical mistake by him, because he kind of gave away the game. He gave away that he was going to Ferrari, and he wasn't going to confirm the exact details until he sees what Ferrari do with Kimi's contract in September. And all we know is that for some reason, Ferrari and Kimi are still negotiating. So at this point, we know that the wheels are fully off the wagon. Okay, Kimi Raikkonen's position at Ferrari is not clear. It's unclear, let's say, and very much, in question. And to me, that's a huge moment in this season, which leads us to Silverstone.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is an oddly specific time to be commenting on when you're gonna on that kind of thing, because it'd be like obviously last year there was, before Hamilton I guess got his extension with Mercedes, there was speculation if he might leave them. It's like him saying, "Oh, I'm not going to comment on it until February 1st, 2024."
Yep.
Which of course that is, I'm pretty certain that is the date that he got we got the big news about the Ferrari move. It's yeah, it was a bit of a weird one to give away, but Silverstone, we had another quite crazy race here because Hamilton had put on probably the best drive of his career. Massa put on possibly the worst drive of his career. And then Kimi, yeah, he had problems in the pit lane again, and it was just a topsy-turvy race with lots of changing conditions. And it ended up with all of them tied on points at the end of it. So things were, even with everything going wrong, things were still close.
On the racing side of things, still though, I think Kimi at this point is still not happy, but he's still feeling okay with the car. He can still drive it. Everything is all good. And like it's mentioned on the slide here, at the end of the British Grand Prix, you've got 3 drivers tied on points. So Hamilton, Massa, and Kimi all tied on points for the lead of the championship, and then Kubica just 2 points behind. So you can see that already this title battle is very, very close. And it's going to require Ferrari to essentially be on top of their game, which we've already discussed that it was probably a team lacking experience. If it's new from the Dream Team, so there's some new faces in there, and things maybe aren't as smooth on the inside as they would like to be, especially with the whole now thing with Alonso essentially knowing Kimi's contract. As a driver, that's got to make you feel unmotivated that your team is pretty much against you at this point, and you're just trying to race as best as you can. It makes you distracted from the actual driving itself, but at least the car was still with Kimi, which then, taking us to the German Grand Prix, is where things start to fall away from him. And Ciaron or Peter, I'm sure you have loads to say on what happened with the car and Kimi in this period of time.
I mean, it's just such a shame that this happened, because Michael Schumacher himself, in an interview with one of the major news networks at the end of the 2008 season, said that he has to protect Kimi, and he feels partly responsible because in the middle of the season, they introduced updates which simply did not suit Kimi's driving style at all. And in fact, what had happened was that in the middle of July, likely after the British Grand Prix, Kimi Raikkonen's front suspension was literally changed without his consent. So this is very important to understand, because this isn't normal behavior. Usually a team and a driver will agree on a major change like that. Massively affect driver form and confidence. And the key thing is that with Kimi, his speed really comes from the front end of the car. He really needs a car that's super positive on the front end, doesn't like understeer on corner entry. And unfortunately, what happened was they changed the front suspension in Germany, and they only returned it to Kimi in Singapore. But in the meantime, as we all know, chaos ensued for Kimi's season, because he was wildly off the pace and struggling with the car in Hockenheim. And this leads us to the second part of July. I mean, that Hockenheim race, and I'll finish my point with this, was a depressing race for Ferrari fans. All weekend, you could see Raikkonen was just struggling massively with the handling. The commentators, like Brundle, James Allen, even noted they lost at sea. And then Massa had manners put on him by Hamilton in the race. So that was really emblematic of the season. Kimi being hindered and Massa not good enough to get the job done.
Yeah, I mean, it's just classic Ferrari. This really is that they have this mentality. Okay, this is the plan, and this is what we'll do, and to be damned with whether the drivers like it or not. because we've had like 2018, they brought in that upgrade pack of 5 or 6 races that ended up being worse, and it took them until Vettel was basically out of the title fight to switch back to the old spec car, and then he was faster again. And throughout the whole hybrid era, basically they were building cars contrary to Vettel's driving style. And you had Russia 2019. This is on the kind of race direction style of like, okay, Vettel took the lead at the start, and they were like, okay, you need to give the place back to Leclerc, and he said no, because then Hamilton will catch me, because again, it wasn't part of the plan for Vettel to take the lead. It's they just have this way of they make a plan and they don't realize that actually maybe other people don't want this, or maybe things are going to happen in real life that don't fit with it. This obviously there is the element of yes, maybe of it being more intentional. The thing that surprises me is that this is something that presumably would have been done with Schumacher's approval, as the one doing all the behind the scenes development. I don't know if that means that Schumacher himself wasn't a big fan of Kimi or didn't like being replaced, but then Schumacher was the one who retired, although there is reason to believe maybe he was pushed instead of jumping. But if he wanted to come back, he very easily could have. It was just a funny one that try and get a bit more hands on with trying to mess things up.
Yeah, and Ciaron, you touched on this, but I think it's really important to stress how, I think, at least for me personally, how weird it is that Kimi basically had little to no feedback on the direction of the car. Bear in mind, in his McLaren years, and not many people know this about Kimi, but he was actually very, very good with feedback, and he had a very specific way he liked the car, and that was one of his biggest strengths, was actually his engineering feedback, his technical development, and being able to develop a really fast car around his driving style. And sort of to take that from him kind of takes away the whole point of having Kimi Raikkonen. You know, he's an extremely quick driver, but you have to listen to his feedback. And as with everybody in Formula One, each driver has their own driving styles, and all of them have different ways that they like to have the car. So if you want to really build a championship winning car for a driver, you need to fundamentally understand how they also like to have the cars set up so that they can drive it consistently and fast. Which, taking that away from the guy who's just won you a world championship, does seem kind of odd. There's even this quote here from Michael Schumacher that I've got where he says, in reference to Kimi, I think I have to protect him in many ways, because in the middle of the season, we made some developments to the car, but Kimi didn't simply get on with these ones. The moment we went back to those changes, we got him back to competitive lap times, which is just so strange. It's like, it's even patronizing to Kimi, as if he doesn't know what he wants with the car, when if you look through the rest of his career, he definitely does know what he wants to do with technical development.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it just shows you two things. Definitely there was some politics going on, but then Ferrari are also quite poor when it comes to just simple operational strength. They weren't able to communicate with their lead driver, the reigning world champion. They somehow turned his strength into a weakness. I mean, only Ferrari could do that. You know, this guy is, as you said, Dan, like, what's the point of hiring Kimi Raikkonen if you're not going to listen to maybe one of the things he's most valued for, which is his incredibly precise and accurate car feedback? And why would you give it to Michael Schumacher to decide those things, to decide car development? Makes absolutely no sense. And Kimi himself echoed this sentiment after the disastrous German Grand Prix, where he said that, and I'm paraphrasing, but we struggle to understand all we can. What's going on. It's not a crisis. But we have to really understand the handling of this car and see if we've taken the right road in terms of. He knew something was going wrong, and he was right, because they took the wrong road in development. And from the middle of July to the end of September, I've read that Kimi only scored 9 points in 6 Grand Prix. That sums it up. I mean, Ferrari really just went into the deep end with this. And, Kimi was very much disadvantaged by the politics and the very questionable car development choices they made, and it really is nonsensical when you think back to it, because you shouldn't have to disadvantage a driver this much, and you shouldn't really be hiring a driver of this caliber if you don't want to listen to them. And as we move on from July, things just got worse and worse. I think quickly then, I mean, at the end of July, there was another press conference where Kimi had to confirm whether he was going to retire. I mean, it feels like Kimi's had to say this already a few times this year, and really quite unjustified. He's the reigning world champion. He's had a ton of bad luck. It's not like this guy's underperforming in terms of his raw talent and speed and commitment. And he simply just reaffirmed that, he wants to continue and he plans to continue. So just a lot going on the political side here, and Kimi unfortunately was the victim.
Yeah, it was. This was where things kind of really got into a full swing, and as we'll see over the next few races, was when the damage was done, and he just scored points, and it was it was hard to. The thing is, it wasn't exactly subtle, because even at the time I was thinking, what is going on here? But again, very new fan that just thought maybe Kimi's just not it. I don't know. I was very, very much laser focused on Lewis at the time. But yeah, the next race would have been Hungary, and that one was again another race where things just didn't really go right for anybody, because Kimi finished third, and then Massa was leading, and then had the engine failure from the lead, and then Lewis had a puncture and fifth or something. So he ended up. I mean, yeah, Kimi ended up benefiting the most, but not really enough from that race. And again, he got beaten by Kovalainen and Glock, and it's like realistically he should have beaten those, but maybe if he had one hand tied behind his back.
Well, that's exactly it, Peter. And one thing I remember from Hungary is that all weekend, from free practice to the race, there were certain corners like turn 3 in Hungary, the long left-hander right after the first hairpin. Kimi would continually lock his rears and push the brake bias rearwards to try and get the front end of the car to turn in on that corner. And from free practice to qualifying to the race, he would always go off and lose the car there. And he did it in the race. He did it in free practice a bunch of times. And everyone was noting that this guy just looked like he was fighting the car. Kimi is very good around Hungary. I mean, you look at his McLaren years, even 2007, he's mega around that track. He has I don't know how many podiums there, and he has one race win there. So to see him so dismally off the pace, like you said, behind Kovalainen, Hamilton, Massa, Glock, you could see he was just struggling with the handling of the car. And it goes back to what we said. The car development was going direction for him. And that leads us to Valencia.
Yeah. And in this time, so you have sort of Kimi looking terrible with the car, like you said, and going into all of these races now, including Valencia, it's just nothing seems to ever go his way. And you brought up earlier, there was sort of like mentions earlier in the season of, Kimi being motivated or not motivated. And we've seen a long time with Kimi, we all know his personality. I think if you've watched F1 or watched any kind of interview with him, he's very quiet and he doesn't like to say a lot, and he just likes to keep himself to himself, and he's not the most outspoken, which I think can lead to you sort of looking at Kimi and going, oh, well, this guy doesn't really care. He's not bothered. And I think Ferrari and some of the media tried to run with this a little bit to sort of give a reason as to why his performance was lacking, because they would often point to his motivation being low. And this is a question I've got for both of you. Do you think if Kimi had been more outspoken in this time period where he goes, it's stupid my contract's being discussed, it's stupid my performance is being discussed, I've had terrible luck, if he sort of took the route other drivers would take, where they just basically go all out war with the team and say, contradict everything and say, this is what's actually happening, do you think that would have helped or hindered him?
it would have basically confirmed that there was some funny things going on, because usually once the driver starts acknowledging it, it's like, okay, I guess that means that there is some traction to this, or rationale. Maybe it would have helped him, I don't know, because maybe it would have forced their hand a bit to start behaving a bit differently if he's actually drawing attention to what they're trying to pull. But yeah, I think it's just a personality thing. I mean, this is the thing about Kimi. He's a man of few words. He doesn't really complain that much. He just kind of takes things as they are, I suppose. But I don't know how helpful it would have been, other than maybe Santander thinking, oh, well, this is creating a lot of negative publicity, and if people are going to start scapegoating us, and if everything goes as we planned it, and then they're like, oh, well, you've done this, Santander, then maybe, but it's hard to.
Such an interesting question, because I agree with the question. It's a great question, and Peter's points are great too, because I think Kimi's personality is passive. He doesn't like to bring up the same thing over and over again in a team. He doesn't like to act like a diva behind the scenes. And I think it could have either gone two ways. Either they would have sacked him like they fired Prost, because they would have said, look, we have a $1 billion deal on the line. We're not going to let you compromise that. Toodles, Or, as Peter said, maybe it would have forced Ferrari's hand to think, hang on here. This is horrible publicity. We have one of the most popular drivers in Formula One creating a bit of a fuss. Maybe we should let him win this title, or maybe we should ease off on putting this pressure and spreading these, and having the media question his motivation, because this makes us look bad. This makes us look like a team, and we don't want any more bad publicity. Because Ferrari have been down that road with Austria 2002, and it's not helpful for them or Santander. I don't know if it would have made a difference, but I think Kimi should have been more vocal, because either he would have gotten fired, or he would have basically forced the team to, change the direction in which things were headed. And to me, maybe it would have been better than what happened, because in the end, it was quite humiliating for him to have to go through all of that and kind of accept his status at the end of the season as a number two. Maybe it would have been better if he had just spoken up, and then either gotten fired and gone out with his head up, held high, or the team would have started to back him a little bit more. We'll never know. It's so difficult, in my opinion, to change the mind of a team when, as both of you have mentioned, literally billions of dollars were at stake here with this Santander deal and the IPO happening. I highly doubt Kimi Raikkonen, who's from Finland, a pretty irrelevant economy in the grand scheme of things in Formula One, would have really been able to move the needle, even if he had complained. As a fan, I wish he had. I wish he had done that, because that would have been his best chance to change course. And yeah, I mean, heading into Valencia again, total mess. Kimi had an engine failure. Massa's leading the championship. Hamilton's leading the championship from Massa. The Massa's claiming that Kimi should probably start to think about backing him at some point. And that was the point where Kimi was given the ultimatum by Ferrari. Either you win at Spa, or you're the number two. And that really that led to one of the most chaotic races we've seen, between or one of the most exciting duels I think we've seen in the modern era between two drivers in a race. But it shows you how much pressure Kimi was under as well.
It does beg the question, actually, is how much Massa knew about any of this, because it involves him in the sense of, oh, well, they Santander, Brazil, they want him to do well. Obviously, Alonso knows about it all because he's the one negotiating with behind the scenes. But it's did Massa actively know? He would have seen, obviously, things are working better in my favor this year. But would he have actually, oh, yeah, they are playing some tricks to try and get Kimi out? You wonder if he knew about that, or if that was only kept in one half of the garage.
As a driver, surely, I mean, I'm thinking from Massa's point of view here, I think you wouldn't want to tell him, right? Because if you think about it, you want him to believe that he's outperforming Kimi Raikkonen and that it's on his sort of merit that he's doing it, because that's going to highly motivate him. So I imagine keeping Massa mostly in the dark and just allowing him to focus purely on driving in the championship and just keeping him in a good headspace would have been really important for the team. That's at least how I would see it if I was Ferrari at this point.
I completely agree with that. Especially someone as fragile as Massa. Just let him live in his own little world. Make him think he's a top driver for once in his life. We'll break that illusion when Alonso comes on board.
Yeah, let him get his really boring wins at Bahrain and Turkey and all of that. Yeah.
Oh my goodness, I mean, it's just absurd when you think about it. And then actually, this goes back to what Dan said, because yet again before Spa, there was talk about Kimi's motivation, right? I mean, how many times does a guy have to answer this question over the course of a season? And it's almost like you can't point to the point gap, because the point gap really isn't that colossal at this stage. Kimi hasn't exactly been the luckiest driver. I mean, he's had huge setup issues. He had an engine failure in Valencia. So yeah, I mean, it's almost like Ferrari are playing into this because they can't talk about anything else. All they can say is, have the media raise this question about motivation. And unfortunately, Kimi has to continually respond to this by saying, no, I'm fully motivated. And he really went into Spa knowing that he had to win it. He was told this by management. Either you win Spa or you're the number 2 for the rest of the season. And that leads us to that chaotic race.
I mean, yeah, this is Spa. Obviously, it's one of his strongest circuits because he's won there 4 times, I think. At this point, it was 3 times. Took his 4th in 2009. Yeah, always been a favorite of his. I mean, he qualified 4th, but then he got up to 2nd at the very start, and then Hamilton spun at last source on the 2nd lap and gave Kimi the lead. And he kept this. It was only until obviously the 2 laps before the end that Lewis managed to catch him and made that lunge at the bus stop, cut the corner, gave him the position back, and then took it back again immediately. And that was when things kind of really, really kicked off. And we had, for me as a new fan, my first experience of, controversial stewarding decisions.
Yeah. Was it a dark day for Formula One? Probably. And to me, I'm biased. It was dark because Massa won the race. I mean, okay, fine. Like, you think Hamilton deserved a penalty. You think Raikkonen deserved to win. These are all valid opinions. In no way did Felipe Massa deserve to be handed that win. That was an absolute joke. And I think Hamilton should have gotten some form of a penalty because he did have a much lesser advantage coming out of that chicane than he otherwise would have. By cutting it. But I don't think, and I don't remember the exact time penalty. Wasn't it like 25 seconds?
Yeah.
Or something like that, Peter? So that's absurd. I mean, at no point did he gain 25 seconds. I don't know where on earth they got that number from. It's almost like Massa's father called in and said, yeah, I think this will be good. So, and let's just remember, Felipe Massa loves to cry about 2008 and say, oh, I was so unlucky in Singapore and I was so good that season. I mean, think about like wins like France where it was gifted to him. Spa, it was absolutely gifted to him. He was nowhere in that race. He was consistently 7/10 off Kimi in the middle sector. I mean, it was just stunning. And that's the kind of thing that, it looks bad for Formula One because that was an exciting race. I think everybody was like, wow, that was worth my Sunday afternoon to sit down and watch that. And then it was just taken away for no reason. So anyways, that's all I have to say about that race.
I think one reason they gave the 25-second time is because they didn't have 5 or 10-second penalties at the time. So the only other option would have been a drive-through, which they couldn't do. But they should have just given him like a 3-place or 5-place grid penalty for the next race. It would have been much more reasonable than what they did here.
Yeah, it's just weird. I mean, at this point, how much, because there's always this thing in F1 where you go, oh, but yeah, Ferrari are really in with the FIA and F1 management and stuff. So at this point, did they still have that influence to all be a little bit favored, or was it kind of like the grid's fairer by 2008?
I think Formula One has always had a preference to delay the title to the final race of and if they thought that Hamilton was going to get, if they had an opportunity, this is how I've always looked at it. If the FIA has an opportunity where they can lessen one driver with credible logic from extending their point gap and thereby make sure that the title goes to the final race, they'll do it. And I think this just gave the FIA an excuse to make the title fight closer than it should have been because Hamilton. Listen, I don't think Lewis drove entirely cleanly in that race, and I'm a massive Kimi Raikkonen fan. I think most people who are aware of that, but Hamilton drove a good race. He fought hard with Kimi. They had a titanic duel. Kimi got it wrong. He wasn't exactly comfortable in those conditions with the car he had, and while Lewis should have gotten some form of a penalty, 25 seconds, as we've all said here, it was ridiculous. And furthermore, to have Massa win the race is furthermore ridiculous. So, yeah, I think there was a little bit of politics going on. Probably Ferrari had, Ferrari had a lot of influence with the FIA at that time. There's no doubt about that. But I also think the FIA just did that because they thought, let's keep the season interesting. Let's keep Massa in the hunt. Let's keep this close. We're having a good season. We don't want Hamilton to just, win this 3 or 2 races before the end. Let's make this go on. Let's give Massa the momentum. And I think that's what happened there, frankly.
And then after the race, there was another spanner thrown into the works when they said that Ferrari announced a contract extension for Kimi until the end of 2010. And so anyone who was following this closely would have been like, okay, well, that's interesting because that seems very contrary to what they're trying, particularly as Alonso is like, oh, this changes nothing. It almost has airs of, Piastri Alpine with it. It's a funny one, but as we've seen in recent years, it seems like nobody seems to obey contracts anymore. If you want to get out of it, you just can. It's a funny one.
Yeah, I imagine, wasn't this less Ferrari's choice and more that Kimi had met the performance quota that he needed to basically activate this extension, so he just did? Because at the end of the day, even if they want to get rid of him at the end of 2009, he's now going to get... There's always these exit clauses and everything, so he's now going to get that massive payout at the end of the season to leave, rather than just being told, we're not renewing you.
Exactly. And this is the key point, is that, remember Alonso said, I'm not saying anything until September. Remember, he said that way back in, I think it was July. So effectively, we hit September, and what happens? Kimi has met, as you said, Dan, he's met the performance clauses. He's done what he needed to do. He gets that automatic extension. And basically, he's probably exceeded the performance benchmarks on his contract in order to get this. And the thing is that, like you said, think about this. If they wanted to cancel Kimi's contract, they would have had to pay him a massive sum of money, as they ended up doing. You see, the problem is that I think Kimi was also trying to think about what he wanted to do in this period. And what I mean by that is that, the rumors had been that Kimi was actually going to leave the team, maybe even at the end of the year. I mean, some rumors were saying that. And Alonso coming out and saying that Kimi extending his contract until 2010 doesn't change anything for me, while there are rumors that Alonso's already signed to Ferrari, effectively means that between Massa, Alonso, and Kimi, one of those drivers would not be at Ferrari in 2010, because there's no way all 3 of them could have driven in the same team. So if you think about it, if you really, really think about it, I think at this point, Ferrari knew, and Kimi probably knew that something was going to happen at the end of 2009, but he still managed to get that extension, which then would necessitate a payout by Ferrari in order to get rid of him at the end of 2009. I think Kimi was already planning for his departure at this point in the season. I really do. And I think Ferrari failed to get him out of the team for 2009 because I think they were trying to do that. There's no doubt in my mind. Ferrari didn't want Kimi in that team. They wanted Alonso and Santander on board ASAP. They couldn't do it. So then the thought process was, we'll have to pay him out early. And that's what they were negotiating, was the payout effectively for his departure in 2009. And, isn't it interesting that Alonso came out with a statement the same day Kimi's contract was also renewed? So what a mess. What a horrible, horrible management style, but that's what happened. And, onto Monza, what a race to head to after all of this went down.
It has an aura of, Kimi uses performance clause. It's super effective kind of thing, as if they'd almost forgotten that part of his. But yeah, Monza, strange race. Obviously, I remember this one very vividly. Vettel's first win came out of nowhere. And it was just, for Ferrari, it was just because the entire weekend was extremely wet. And it was just a really bad race from both McLaren and Ferrari. They just had no pace. And Kimi and Lewis both got knocked out in Q2 in qualifying. And they got into Hamilton got into the points. Kimi didn't in the end. But it was just a bizarre race where none of them really capitalized on each other. And it paved the way for Vettel to take his historic win.
Yeah, this weekend it works well. This weekend feels like it should be more in sort of the style of that Hunt versus Lauda, but without them podcast that's to come. That it's like one of those where it's like, what, this happened this season, and it was just really caught everyone off guard. And then Sebastian Vettel's winning in a Toro Rosso that was a Minardi a few seasons ago. It's just crazy. So yeah, a very strange one. And Italy, the home of Ferrari, I imagine for them to not really perform there hurt a lot, but yeah, a really strange one that just kind of crops up in the middle of the season and has an explanation, but it just doesn't feel real. But yeah, a very interesting race.
They performed in one sense that obviously the Toro Rosso had a Ferrari engine in it, but they got beaten by one of their customers, and also Red Bull got beaten by their own B team. So not a good race all round for a lot of people, but it meant that Kimi was already falling behind in the title, but didn't fall behind as drastically as he otherwise would have when you lost, 3 points to Massa and 2 to Hamilton at the end of the day.
Yeah. That race was a mess for Ferrari. I don't really know how else to put it. I mean, Kimi was lost. Let's see. Massa didn't exactly drive the best race of his career. It was an interesting race because I really felt like Formula One changed after that race, because suddenly the old guard it didn't seem like they were fading, but it really felt like there was a new guard that Formula One was going to be looking at for the next decade. Between Hamilton and Vettel, Kubica was in there at the time, Rosberg, all these names that we hadn't heard about even 1 year or 2 years ago. Suddenly these guys were just all in the mix, weren't they? I mean, the world truly was introduced to Sebastian Vettel that day. And, Vettel was awesome in the second half of that season. I have to say, he drove the wheels off that Toro Rosso. It was an incredibly quick car in Monza. Bourdais qualified fourth. But, that was probably the best performance anybody with a Ferrari engine put in all season, frankly. That was stunning stuff by Vettel. And his friend Kimi, unfortunately, was still going through a little bit of a difficult position, a difficult time. And so this leads us to Singapore, where after all the rumors of him potentially being ousted, him potentially losing his motivation that season, he finally got his old suspension back in Singapore. But this race was so chaotic, known for for the Crashgate scandal and for what effectively was a manipulated result. But in true Ferrari fashion, they botched the pit stop, which probably cost Massa a likely win. And Kimi crashed in that race as well when he was trying to catch up with cars in front of him at the end. So, all around operational failure by Ferrari once again, and Hamilton extended his lead in the world title. So,
at this point, do you think that Kimi himself as well? I mean, first of all, you've got to talk. He has his old suspension back, so in theory, he should be back to performing at like the top level, like he was at the start of the season. But then he crashes out in this race. Do you think his mental state must have been really suffering at this point? You've already said that, at least in your opinion. I agree with you on this. I think by now he's already sort of come to terms with the fact that he's going to be leaving Ferrari, if not F1, by the end of 2009. But at least he's going to be leaving with a massive paycheck. He's then had this whole season. I mean, since Canada, his luck has been, well, even Monaco, his luck's just been terrible. He's had penalties, crashes, reliability issues. It really must wear you down as a driver. So you must just think at this point, surely his mental state, he's barely in the championship fight anymore. It must be completely degraded, and seeing his teammate outperforming as well. So in Kimi's mind, what do you think's going on, and how much do you think he actually, at this point, is motivated to continue?
Really good question. I've read from internal sources that this was one of the only times that Kimi was really second guessing himself. Because when you're a driver like him, and I know Peter started watching in 2008. I know you said you were 4 this season, Dan, so
yeah,
it's all right. I started watching F1 in 1997, and Kimi Raikkonen, since the middle of 2000, was just the hottest property out there. He was so hyped up in Formula Renault, but then nobody knew who he was. He came out of nowhere, so there was still some question marks. And he was just an unstoppable force of speed, basically, at McLaren. And, nobody ever questioned this guy's talent. He was basically considered to be the fastest driver in Formula One, the image of somebody who could drive anything. You put him on a motorcycle, you put him in a car, you put him on a skidoo. He's just wickedly quick. And that aura of invincibility, that aura of just total speed was smashed in a way that for Kimi fans hurt. It really hurt. And for Kimi himself, I have no doubt. And from what I've heard from team insiders, made him question himself. Because, yes, something's wrong with the car. Yes, there are politics going on. That Ferrari have tried to oust you in 2009 already. So that you leave 2 years before your contract ends, and that even though you've got the contract in 2010, Ferrari are, you're likely just planning to exit at the end of 2009 to get that paycheck, that cash payout for ending your contract early. But it still is a new feeling to be this much behind for someone like him. He'd never gone through that, and it messed with his head. He made uncharacteristic errors in Singapore, and it just made the team weaker. It was a bad strategy by Ferrari because you can't, if the driver you're effectively disadvantaging is the more talented driver, your team becomes exponentially weaker because of that. And that's what happened. I think part of that was Kimi himself losing a little bit of confidence. There's no way you can't. Think about it. I mean, to go from being the great Kimi Raikkonen to suddenly like everyone saying, "Are you going to retire at the end of the year?" And suddenly you're number 2 to a guy that you. Let me quickly make a detour here. I don't want to speak for too long. Kimi obliterated Massa in Formula Renault. They were in the same category, and it was a joke. Like Massa would never ever be anywhere near Kimi in the junior. Massa was a driver who was never considered a top driver. Right? Think about Massa's career. He was fired from Sauber in his first year. He was fired for poor performance. They brought Frenzen in for the last 2 races. He didn't race in 2003, and his testing times were not that much better than Luca Badoer's. 2004, he was thrashed by Fisichella. 2005, he barely beat Jacques Villeneuve, and Jacques Villeneuve was way past his peak. 06, thrashed by Michael, beaten by Kimi 07. Nobody on the planet expected Kimi to have a season like that and for Felipe Massa to beat him. Nobody did. Nobody thought that. So something very fundamental changed in the image of Kimi Raikkonen because the world was also tuning in 2008. It was an exciting season. And the image that people got of Kimi was, he's not all that, is he? But he was all that. He was all that. He was mega. He's so unbelievably fast. So yes, I think he also was going through a little bit of a struggle mentally. No doubt about it. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think because at this point was when they brought in the new suspension, or that the old suspension, they brought it back. I imagine they were thinking, okay, well, we've done what we needed to do in terms of taking Kimi out of this fight and kind of wrecking things for him. We still need to win the constructors, though. So even though Kovalainen is being useless at money to try and make sure we can get that, so that was probably part of the rationale. I think with Singapore, he just kind of got unlucky because this is when they still had that stupid chicane. With cars through, it was just you just had to squeeze between some very high rumble strips, and just got caught on those and went in the wall. Because now it's just a corner, even though in the race there last year, that's where George crashed on the last lap. Kind of shows in that he then got 3 30s in a row. That suddenly things have come back to him. But it's Ferrari in general, you just never the way they operate themselves is very different to every other team. And I said this before, they have a plan and they stick to it, and they don't really care if other people don't like it or if reality doesn't line up with it. And it seems the case with this that they could have. This is a title that Kimi should have got in the same way that he should have won in 2005, and it just didn't happen. It's a funny Ferrari. They're a very strange out.
You look at this one. And when you were talking about Massa there, Ciaron, I was thinking this. Had alternate history happens and Massa does win the championship somehow, and then all of this starts coming to light about Kimi's contract and him, essentially Ferrari just not wanting him to be part of the world title, it takes me back to when we were doing our ranking videos of the F1 champions. I think there's the argument there to be made that Massa would have been the least deserving F1 champion, along with like the likes of Phil Hill and stuff. So it's a bit of a tangent, but I think it's just insane to me how close he came to winning the title. When you look at all of the stats, you look at his lap times, like you said, 7/10 off Kimi, was it, in Sector 2 of Spa? It's just like how this man even got to that place to start with is unbelievable.
Well, look, again, like I don't want to turn this into a Felipe Massa bashing session, but guys, look at this. The only time in Massa's career that he looked like a good, like a, let's say, top driver, when was that? 2007 to 2009. And really it was 08 and 09. What a coincidence that the years Kimi is completely lost at sea with car setup, with politics, with the Santander saga, that Massa looks at his best. And I've always said this, and people don't agree with me, but I've always said that Massa wasn't exactly driving well. It was Kimi who was driving way below his usual performance. And that flattered Massa. And I still believe to this day, again, like look at Massa before that. He was just absolutely getting hammered by his teammates before, and he got hammered by his teammates after. Right? Bottas easily dismantled Massa. Alonso, we don't even need to get into what he did to Massa. That was just... So at the end of the day, this was the only period Massa ever looked like a true top driver. And it's because Kimi was being dragged down. And I maintain that the accident Massa had was not the reason for his performance drop post-accident. It was Hockenheim 2010 when he got a little taste of the medicine Kimi was going through in 2008, where the team explicitly told Massa in no uncertain terms, you are the number 2. And Massa couldn't handle that and completely collapsed. His confidence, his mannerisms, I've even said the tone of his voice even seems different. It's almost like he got more timid, you know? The Massa of 06, 07, 08, look at him in press conferences, this is an aggressive young guy. He became very timid at Ferrari when Alonso came. So, you know, I agree with you, Dan. I think he would have gone down as certainly the worst modern world champion ever. Maybe only Phil Hill would be ranked below him. I would certainly put Jacques Villeneuve and Damon Hill above Felipe Massa in that situation.
He was just a bit of a ghost in those Ferrari years with Alonso, because that, like, what should have been a 6-way battle was a 5-way battle, because we had both Ferraris, both Red Bulls, and then Alonso, and he was just never there, and he didn't say much, he didn't do much, and there was the odd podium. Even in the games it shows up, because in F1 2012 he's always getting knocked out in Q2 and stuff, so even the games knew it. I think, yeah, I still feel like there is a bit of a distinction kind of post, but maybe that's just the differing circumstances. But that, in one sense, gives an excuse, because it's easy to say, oh, well, look how different he was after the crash. And yeah, I mean, because, I mean, 2009, it was still fairly even between him and Kimi until the accident, but I guess we'll get into that.
Yeah. I mean, Massa had a good start to 2010. You know, I think he was leading the championship in 2010 after Malaysia. Then he just had some unlucky races, and then he was again leading Alonso in Hockenheim. It was really after Hockenheim that he disappeared, in my opinion. He was there in early 2010. I mean, he had some good races, like Bahrain, he was there. I think he was decent in China, if I remember correctly. Malaysia, he was leading the title. He had a good race in Australia. Kept Alonso at bay despite team orders. But it was after Hockenheim where he said that he felt completely demoralized. And I don't think he ever regained his confidence after that, because, first of all, what a stupid message to give a driver. Like, how humiliating is that? To just, like, why is the message another driver is faster than you? You know, that's just a very brutal way to tell a driver to move aside. You could just say something like 163, 163, or multi 21 or something like that. But except Massa would have obeyed multi 21. Anyways,
Yeah.
so the point, he would have been like, okay, no problem.
But in this case, it would have been, well, to swap, it would have been what, multi 12.
Multi 12, exactly.
Yeah.
Good call. So
the thing is, he wasn't even like Ross only. He wasn't, probably because he didn't like it either. He wasn't even subtle. Like the way he enunciated it, and then afterwards he was said sorry. Like, okay, yeah, you've made this obvious, probably deliberately, because otherwise it would have maybe not looked so obvious without that radio message.
It was odd, and I think that's where Massa, in my opinion, this is my opinion, but that's where I think Massa really dropped off. Because after that he was just awful for the remainder of 2010. 11 was a horrific season. He should be embarrassed by his performance in 2012. And 13 was okay in certain moments, but pretty average overall. At which point he was relieved of his suffering at Ferrari and went to partner Bottas. So Massa was there. It's just, I think mentally he was destroyed by Alonso. And, you know, the reason I know that this is mental is that he always says that when a driver is losing to Alonso, he's like, oh, it's because Alonso's gotten in their head. Have you noticed that anytime Alonso is critiquing other teammates of Alonso, he says, oh, Alonso's gotten in their head. But so many times that isn't the reason why. You know, with Kimi, that was not the reason why. It was fundamentally the rookie race engineer and the car setup in 2014, which was just undrivable. With Esteban Ocon, I don't really know what on earth was going on there. I think Ocon and Alonso just didn't like each other at one point. You know, Massa himself was mentally defeated by Alonso, in my opinion. But I'll leave it at that. That's really going off the path a little bit. But, you know, if we continue then with 2008, we move on from September here, where did we land? Right, we landed into the final few races of the season, and you know what I want to quickly say before I stop talking is Kimi was quicker than Massa in Japan and China. Remember, Kimi had to stop basically on the main straight, slow down on the main straight, on the back straight in China to let Massa by. He was so much quicker in the race, wasn't he? So it really does hit home the point that Kimi, with the suspension back, was back to similar level where he was in the beginning of the season. So what a mess by Ferrari, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's really just a shambles at the end of the season. It's a bit of a scramble from Ferrari, isn't it? Because I think they realized that actually this title hasn't come to them as comfortably as they sort of hoped near the start of the season, when they looked, I would say, quite a bit faster than the McLaren initially, and then they dropped off. But yeah, it's a strange one because, like, again, Massa made his fair share of mistakes, sure, but he also did just have bad luck as well. And I think from even like Lewis, and even if you put Kimi in a good car for the whole season, let's say it was those three vying for the championship by the final round, overall from all the drivers, it was just quite an inconsistent season. And it was a really weird one because a lot of people say, like, oh yeah, of course Hamilton deserved 2007. This is like a common rhetoric you see online. And you always go, but 2008 just felt like it was so messy from him that it didn't even make sense he won it. But I think that just sort of sums the season up was how messy both Ferrari and McLaren were in being able to just finally stitch this title battle up and get it over and done with.
That's why Vettel is my driver of the season, because all of these guys messed it up so badly.
I mean, I think there's a very strong argument to say that Massa, Hamilton, and Kimi had better seasons in 2007 than they did in 2008. Even Massa. And Massa made a lot of mistakes in 2008, and he had a very lucky, a few of his wins were just unbelievably lucky. So, yeah, I think it was a poorly driven season overall. It's just that Hamilton was slightly less poor than Massa. And the only reason McLaren didn't win that constructors title, which they should have, given Kimi's struggles, was because, as Peter has mentioned, I don't know what Kovalainen was doing that season, and he was just so anonymous. What's the saying? If you want to win, hire a Finn. Evidently not Kovalainen. I mean, it doesn't apply to him, does it?
Yeah, he was kind of the Bottas of his era, but I guess you could argue even worse than Bottas at the end of the day, because Bottas, compared to Lewis, he was at least there or thereabouts in qualifying, but had absolutely no racecraft and could only lead from the front. Kovalainen was usually nowhere near Lewis in qualifying. I mean, he got one pole position in Silverstone, and then by the end of the fifth lap, roughly, he'd lost the lead to Lewis, and then I think finished off the podium. And he got his one win in Hungary, which he only got because Hamilton had his puncture and Massa got the engine failure. And he did have, to be fair, Hamilton had no reliability problems all year, but Kovalainen did, because he had that tyre blowout right at the end of Spain and he ended up on a stretcher. And then his engine went on like the last lap in Spa as well, but again, he was miles down. But even so, his pace was nowhere, and he got only 2 or 3 podiums the whole season. It was just not. And he was even worse in 2009. But then he was supreme when he was at Lotus and Caterham, but the car was so bad you wouldn't even know. It was a waste having him as a second driver for them, and that was what cost them the constructors.
I think so. I think you're spot on there. The problem with Heike was that he never really improved. If McLaren had seen some kind of an improvement from 08 to 09, maybe they would have re-signed him for 2010, but I think he got worse. So, I don't think he should have gotten that seat to begin with. Nick Heidfeld should have been in that other seat, in my opinion, or Nico Rosberg. What a lineup that would have been. But I think ultimately, look, I mean, the season came down to what was a crazy finale. It came down to an unbelievably tense last lap. And again, I want to stress one thing here quickly. Even in Brazil, Kimi was told not to push. So Massa knew he didn't have to worry about Kimi like racing him in that race. Because they said, look, Kimi, if you crash in these conditions, that could give Hamilton a position. And we'd rather you just hold position. Just hold your third place. Don't attack Alonso. Don't attack Massa. So we don't actually know how quick Kimi could have gone in Brazil. And I always say this, that Kimi wasn't racing in Brazil. He was basically just driving around, listening to his team tell him where to be. So 90% of the fans that watched this season loved it because they're like, it was neutral's dream, entertainment, crazy last lap. Fans got their money's worth. I despise this season. And I don't despise it for any other reason in that so many of the results were undeserved. And there was so much dirty politics going on, especially at Ferrari, that makes it unenjoyable for me to watch because I know that there could be more performance here. And because of the operational incompetence of one team, we didn't get to see it. But that's just my take on it.
Yeah, I think to an extent I agree. Like, it does feel manufactured, but not in the way Ferrari wanted, which in a way is to me a bit of karma. I think it's kind of funny. I always think that Kimi sort of got the last laugh in this story because the idea was Santander come in and they go, okay, we'll sponsor you. Ideally, you've got a Brazilian world champion for our new expansion into Brazil. And then we bring in Spanish driver Alonso, and it's going to, bring us billions and billions in marketing revenue and shares. And then it's just hilarious because the season is essentially completed with Timo Glock going slowly and Hamilton winning the title after Massa's entire family and Massa himself are celebrating. And then you get Kimi rinsing Ferrari for as much money as he can and going off and enjoying WRC for a couple of years before he comes back and redeems himself in F1, thankfully, and is able to show that he actually is a very quick driver with Lotus. So in a way, and then of course everything that's happened to Ferrari since, like literally not being able to win a constructors or a drivers world championship in the 15 or whatever years it's been since 2008. Which I think just overall is quite funny to me because it's like you tried to do all this and in the end you ended up sabotaging yourselves and never being able to replicate what you had before it. So kind of a last laugh for Kimi if he ever wants to look back at it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Kimi really likes Ferrari because I would never have returned to a team that behaved like this. And this guy must really like just being a Ferrari driver and telling his friends or something. I don't understand it. I really don't understand it. It's like we know what happened. We have the executive vice president of communications at Santander coming out when they had finally announced Kimi was leaving in 2009, which we'll get to. And he came out and said, look, in Brazil, there are 50 million fans of F1. 80% of them are Ferrari fans. And now they feel happy that they're also a part of the Santander group. And the decision to cut Kimi was a rational business decision, just like the decision to sponsor McLaren 3 years ago. This was a man who was completely caught up in a commercial deal, as we've all mentioned on this podcast, that would bring Ferrari and Santander billions of dollars. That's what happened. And if they could have kicked them out in 2009 already, they would have done so. But they managed to kick him out 1 year before the end of his contract, at the end of 2009. And even though he got the payday, even though he got, in some ways, the last laugh, I'm a Kimi fan. I'm a Formula One fan. It was humiliating. There is no way a driver of that caliber, one of the finest drivers on the planet, should be out of F1 at that age. He was 29, wasn't he? I mean, what's a 29-year-old superstar doing out of the sport because Santander want that? I found that outrageous. And because Kimi was not exactly a media favorite, I felt like the media was pretty light on that. They're just like, oh yeah, he has no motivation. he wants to go do other things. That's just nonsense. This guy was effectively forced out of F1, and he didn't want to accept the McLaren offer because it was paying him less, which I think was a mistake by Kimi because, I would have loved to have seen him up against Hamilton in 2010, 11, and 12. But I understand where he's coming from. He felt like he was getting paid more from Ferrari to just sit out. And so he tried something new. But the whole thing was just painful because there's just no way a driver of that caliber shouldn't have been racing in F1. And it's why Luca de Montezemolo had to apologize to Kimi for Kimi to come back to the team in 2014. That was a great moment. That was like proof that Ferrari had made the wrong choice, that they rehired one of their own drivers. They rarely do that. So, anyways, moving on to some other details in 2009, unless you guys have any other things to add to this.
I think we've covered 2008, all the main bulk of it. But yeah, so I mean, 2009, this one, the circumstances are very different in a lot of ways because we had a new rule set which has turned the grid on its head. And for me, as a relatively new fan, it was very strange to see, well, what was Honda and Red Bull running at the front, and then Ferrari and McLaren running at the back. But it meant, obviously not brilliant year for Ferrari. Massa has the crash. Then they put in some upgrades, and then Kimi takes that win in Spa. And that's when you get them saying, suddenly they start supporting him and they start dropping the lack of motivation line. But they're still not wanting to confirm him for 2010.
I knew that he was already going to leave the team, but I especially knew it because there was no way they were going to fire a guy in the hospital like that. Even if you didn't realize what was going on behind the scenes, there was no way with Alonso signed on for the next season that Ferrari were going to fire their driver who had just been in an accident like that. The amount of negative PR, if they had fired Massa in a hospital bed in critical condition, would have been like overwhelmingly bad for Ferrari. So, that had nothing to do with the final decision. Kimi's fate was sealed the year before, but it just goes to show you, like, a driver who was winning races in that car, which was so uncompetitive, and doing a good job, was fired effectively. And what I always find interesting is that they asked Kimi, why do you think this happened? Like, why were you fired? And Kimi said it point blank in 2010 while he was in WRC. He's like, I don't know. They probably made a deal with Santander. He basically is telling us, like, look, this was commercial. And all the excuses Ferrari came out with were just so disrespectful, like saying things like, oh, we need a leader like Alonso, or, yeah, we need somebody like Alonso who's more like Schumacher. Like, none of it made any sense because Kimi had done a really good job at the team with what he was given. And, whether it was Kimi's comments after 2009, whether it was Santander's own comments, it was clear. Kimi Raikkonen was not fired because he didn't do it. He was fired because they wanted to make room for Santander and, by extension, Santander's driver, Fernando Alonso. And Kimi was the casualty, given Massa was Brazilian, and Santander was also planning to have an IPO in Brazil in 2009, which went extremely well for them, and continue to grow in Brazil, which was Santander's largest market. So this was a man who was completely sabotaged by the politics of the situation.
Definitely.
Dan,
I think with Santander coming in the next year and obviously the decision already being made, do you think that with that decision already being in place, and then there was Massa's big accident, which obviously put him out for quite a few, was it the whole season he was out for after that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it actually, in a way, it worked in Ferrari's favor that they didn't have a competitive car? Because it kind of just meant they could leave Kimi to it without having to intervene too much, which wouldn't create more tension. And I guess Kimi was already sort of settled after 2008 with the fact that he kind of was going to have to find somewhere else after Ferrari. I mean, I don't know. You guys may have different opinions on this, but I feel like actually, in the grand scheme of things for Ferrari, them not being that competitive that year probably was a little bit beneficial to them in terms of politics at the team.
I mean, I think that car was competitive, like in the second half. First half of the season, like with McLaren, it was useless. But by the middle half, both of them had got the car sorted. McLaren they went from having what was almost the slowest car, they slapped a double diffuser on it, and then Hamilton wins the next race. And then by this point, Kimi, he gets the win in Spa and he starts getting podiums. But the thing is, what makes it look different is the fact that Luca Badoer and Giancarlo Fisichella didn't get any points and were both abominable. I mean, especially Badoer. But yeah, the second half it was a decent car because he managed to get them up to fourth in the constructors in the end. I think possibly third. I don't think they beat McLaren. It raised some questions. I think maybe it was the lack of testing, the reason that Badoer and Fisichella struggled so much, even though Fisichella had still been racing at Force India all season, and then switches over to Ferrari, and there's just nothing there.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, that makes sense. Just again, it was a weird season, wasn't it? Because you had Brawn on top, obviously, for the first start, and then the whole double diffuser debacle, which is just like a story of its own that you kind of don't need to go into. But yeah, it's just a quiet season from Raikkonen due to the lack of performance near the start Ferrari had, and then obviously things do pick up at the end, but not to the extent that was necessary. And the main focus of the media at that time was on Jenson Button, who has come out of nowhere to sort of challenge for the title. So yeah, it's a really interesting one. I think if we'd seen Ferrari near the front, then there would have been like a whole nother chapter to this Santander story where it's like, there's another season of Massa on top, and then there's the big accident, and then what do you do with Kimi? So yeah.
Well, Kimi took off. I mean, he was unbelievable in the second half of the season, and he had actually out-qualified Massa before the accident. There's a story of 2009, which I think is into our discussion here, and Ferrari mechanics apparently at the end of the season were amazed at how quickly Kimi was driving, and this was triggered by a front suspension change of some sort. And they asked Kimi, I think near the end of the season, why didn't you tell us before? According to James Allen, who was a commentator in F1 and ITV prior to James Allen reported that the Ferrari mechanics asked Kimi and engineers asked Kimi, why didn't you tell us about this change earlier? And Kimi responded, I did. And that sums up the relationship between those two, because there was such miscommunication between Ferrari and Kimi that carried on to 2009. Yeah, it's a good thing that car wasn't competitive, because that probably would have been another blown title that they should have won. So I agree with that. And yeah, it was just a disaster, And I think I wasn't surprised when they announced that they were buying out his contract, but it it kind of leads us to the next, I think, topic of discussion here, which is really thinking about everything that's happened. And in my opinion, if we are thinking about all the events holistically, yeah, I do think Kimi Raikkonen was sabotaged, because he was purposely disadvantaged to benefit Ferrari's commercial status and commercial aims, which we have outlined were focused on securing sponsorship from one of the largest banks in the world and promoting one of their drivers to help that sponsorship produce an ROI that was in line with Ferrari's investment targets. I want to quickly say one quote from Chris Dyer at the end of 2008. He said, Chris Dyer was Kimi's race engineer, and he became technical director or something or chief of trackside engineering after that at Ferrari. He infamously was fired after Abu Dhabi 2010 for making that strategy call. But he said, we had a hard and tough season, but Kimi did exactly the right thing within the team. Everyone respected what he did and how he reacted to the situation. We had a fantastic car, but unfortunately, we made mistakes when thinking about what's best for our driver, bracket Raikkonen. Kimi was sabotaged. He was sabotaged. And that's my view on it. Before I continue, I'll let you guys, chime in on that. But This to me, this is like a textbook definition of internal sabotage for commercial benefit. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I suppose the most pertinent thing was obviously that once he had left, and then it was, as everyone was predicting, it was Alonso that came in, and yeah, there was a big Santander logo splashed across his and Massa's chests on their overalls come 20. So yeah, the proof was in the pudding. But it meant then, so Kimi, he'd had what 2 years in WRC, and then he came back in 2012. And was busy bankrupting Lotus with another performance clause. But yeah, there was a little bit that came out at the end of 2012, just kind of reflecting on his time with Ferrari, and I suppose probably gloating that maybe they hadn't things really were not that Alonso was okay in terms of performance, basically delivering, but a lot more hostile than Kimi, a lot more difficult to deal with. That it's like, okay, you've gone through all this effort to get Alonso in my place, and you've had one season where you got obliterated by Red Bull, and then two where you lost it right at the last second. So maybe he thought kind of, well, no harm lost, but by the end of that, I don't know.
Yeah. I think I would agree with the whole sort of rhetoric that he was sabotaged. I think it's hard to even argue against it now, because like you've got all these sources that essentially just come out and admit that it was nothing to do with Raikkonen. It wasn't even anything personal, and it was just all commercial. And that is, like you said, the definition of sabotage. It's not necessarily the reasoning behind it. It's just the fact that he was intentionally slowed down by his team. For doesn't matter what for, he just was. Which, at the end of the day, it's something that it does hurt the integrity, like you said, Ciaron, of F1 and the sport. And I can see honestly why, like looking back at it, especially if you're a Ferrari or Kimi fan, it does leave a sour taste in your mouth because it's something that shouldn't have happened. You want to see drivers performing at their best and the team supporting them to do that, not drivers being favored because it's going to help $1 billion business deal.
Agreed. I couldn't agree more. And I think Kimi was of the same mindset because they asked Kimi, how do you feel? And after he left Ferrari, and he's like, to me, leaving there was a relief. You don't say that about a team unless a lot of things are happening behind the scenes. So, this is a guy who, in many ways, is very, despite his image as this like wild, partying, rude, monotonous individual. I actually think he's quite professional when he goes to the track. He never really speaks badly about his team. He never seems entitled, either on the radio or in his interviews. He's a team player. I've seen him move aside for all his teammates, even if he's way quicker than his teammates if he needs to. He's extremely good with the engineers, and he doesn't create politics. And these are the things that went against him. They used him, preyed on him, they humiliated him, they smashed his reputation. The once great Raikkonen of McLaren in 2007 was made to look like a joke in 2008. And that's unforgivable. I'm sorry, that is unforgivable. You know what I mean? And I always say that this is the thing about F1 drivers. It's not enough to be a super mega talent like Kimi Raikkonen. He managed to win that title and he deserved it. You need to be able to play the political game. And that's why when people say this is a political driver, that's not just some random term people are throwing around. Politics is the way you win in Formula. It's how you get the team, the management, the mechanics on your side. You get the developments you want. It's so much more about who is the most skilled driver on the track. And I don't like that. I personally like pure competition. I just want to see the quickest blokes race each other. But Kimi fell victim to that. It should be spoken about more. And I'll end off this little loop here as we head into the question section, that Kimi's too forgiving. I would never have forgiven Ferrari for doing something like this. Never. And I would have been very much excited to go back to McLaren because Kimi would have won the title in 2008 without this, politics going on. They had the quickest car in 2008, Ferrari did. But they didn't have the right driver leading the title charge. And it's just amazing to me that all Kimi wanted was an apology from Luca de Montezemolo in order to re-sign in 2014. I would have told him to, I would have had some select words for Mr. de Montezemolo, frankly. But that's just me.
It would have been interesting if you tried to reverse the roles. So pretend that, Santander are trying to get Kimi into Ferrari and it's Alonso they're trying to get rid of. Is
Oh my
that
God.
this would have all been notorious. It would have been like GP2 engine times 100 because Alonso would have just been complaining all year in press conferences and playing the victim and, having a go at them over the radio and that. It would have been much more obvious. Kimi would have just probably said absolutely nothing. Partly strategically, but also because he just wouldn't have said anything. And the same with Lewis, he would have played the victim as well.
Oh my God.
Always saying, "Oh yeah, I've always got one hand behind my back," and all that. Although I must add that if Ferrari produce like the best car on the grid in 2026, I think we can kind of throw away the idea of him being so victimized all the time.
Yeah, I again, like you said with the Montezemolo and also the role reversal, it is crazy just how much Kimi. I guess he just doesn't really care about the political side of F1. I mean, he was just so quiet. We touched on it earlier because I remember asking the question like how he just was so reserved. He just kept himself to himself, which in a way financially did benefit him because I think that allowed Ferrari, to go, well, okay, you've sort of played the game for us and done everything we've asked, so we don't mind giving you this massive contract payout as much as if it was Alonso who would be shouting on the radio every 2 minutes. But yeah, to just go and forgive him, it must have been a good apology. Let's just say that. One other thing I was going to ask was, let's alternate timeline here. Kimi never comes back to F1. He's just fed up. Do you think the fact that he got to come back to F1 and had that drive with Lotus and then the Ferrari years later on, again, sort of re-solidified his reputation of, yeah, this guy is one of the most legendary drivers ever. And if he hadn't have come back, how tarnished would his reputation have been if his career ended in 2009?
Peter, I'm going to start with that. So I think that Kimi Raikkonen improved his reputation overall. And I'll tell you why I think that. This guy was totally forgotten about within 2 years. I've never seen a superstar just suddenly, it's like they've never seen him race. I remember when he came back to F1 in 2012, people were like, oh yeah, that Kimi bloke. Yeah, he raced, didn't he? Yeah, he was good. He won a title. And I was a Kimi fan. I'm thinking, no, this is the Kimi Raikkonen. Like get excited. Like, this is amazing. This is a monumental moment in F1 history. And when he came back for those 2 years in Lotus, everyone realized what they had been missing because he's such good racecraft. He was such an exciting driver. The radio moments were gold. They realized like F1 without Kimi is not the same. And that, I really think those Lotus years kind of helped solidify him. And even though he had some horrific years at Ferrari, he had some great moments like that win in Austin. People were accepting that he was getting older, and they started to look at him throughout his career. They didn't just focus on one moment. They said, okay, look, he's 40 years old, and he just won a race with Ferrari. He's had such an amazing career. Let's celebrate Kimi while he's still here. While when he had left, it was like good riddance, that ungrateful, unmotivated, lazy Finn. And I found that outrageous, and my channel was created because I saw just the most outrageous things being said about him that I knew were lies. People saying like, this guy gave up, he doesn't care, he's overrated. And that drove me nuts because I had seen all of this that we're discussing, I think before most fans had. I mean, you guys are pretty astute. But at the time, I was a little older, and then maybe some of the other fans and that I was talking to, and they just had no clue what was going on. They just thought Kimi was a fat, lazy, drunk Finn who just was a joke and fluked into a title. And he's the opposite. He's a mega racer. He's a total professional. And I think that to answer your question, in my opinion, it's good that he came back because he managed to solidify his legacy amongst a whole new generation of fans who then went back and looked at what he did in the past. And now he's kind of like an icon, like everyone loves Kimi. And I don't think he was ever this popular in that sense because he only seemed to get more popular with his radio messages and things like that. And in an ironic way, that made people then be like, whoa, let me see his early years. They'd say, whoa, this guy was mega at McLaren. He was like unbelievable. This guy was mega in 2007. Who is this guy? So his longevity helped solidify his legacy, and thus, I believe the comeback was a good decision.
So if he had left in 09 and not come back, I think he would have. It would have been a similar sort of thing to say Montoya, of somebody supremely talented that really shook things up, but then ended up leaving before their time. Obviously, very different circumstances, but it would have left a lot of questions of, well, what would have happened if they'd stayed a bit longer and seen it out. When he did come back, again, I had a different perspective because I hadn't been watching. I'd barely watched Formula One when he was at McLaren, and I didn't know who he was, so I didn't see any of that. And my perspective of him, which I never really liked, it took me a while to rub off, was that just being very aloof and very quiet, not saying anything, just seeming to not care, and also coming across very kind of, I suppose, ungrateful for the very privileged position he was in for being a Formula One driver. But when he came back, 2 good years with Lotus, obviously. Well, what took 1 win in the end. The Ferrari years, though, the thing is, he was in the position of being Vettel's number 2, but at the same time, there weren't that many races where they were actually like close on pace as well, and took that as being okay. Well, Vettel of the 2 is the one who's going to want to build the team around him in the same way that he did with Red Bull. And Kimi just being his very mild-mannered, quiet person, not wanting to create such of a fuss. But there weren't. He just didn't have. He became more famous for his radio comments than his driving on his comeback. That's the thing, because everyone remembers just bore and and for what and all of that kind of thing. Like it's not really. It's the same. The Alfa Romeo years. It's not his driving they remember. They remember like his relationship with Giovinazzi and radio comments and blah blah blah, that sort of thing.
So you're right. I agree with that, and that frustrated me as well because people were forgetting about the driver at times. But I'm going to just quickly jump in and say Kimi had 4 bad seasons in his career. Every single time, apart from the politics, it was also to do with the car setup and the tires that he was on that didn't suit him. And those seasons, and for a little bit of context, remember, on top of all the things we've discussed today, the politics, in 2007 and 8, Kimi had to adapt to a new tire that he hadn't raced on at McLaren, Massa had, and a new team that he never raced at, which Massa had driven for effectively since 2003. So already Kimi was on the back foot, and he won the title in 07, despite the car not being perfect for him. But in 08, it was really bad for him, as we discussed, for the reasons we alluded. So that was the first season Kimi had, which was properly bad. 14 was properly bad because the setup of the car was nowhere, and he had a rookie race engineer who was then relieved of his duties after the season. 15 was because the 15 car carried over a lot of the things of the 14 car. He was completely lost at sea. And then in 17, same issues. Him and Vettel had differing opinions about the front suspension of the car, and they went in Vettel's direction because they probably thought Vettel was the better driver at that point. And so Kimi just struggled with that car as well. So it always comes down to a similar theme. It comes down to car handling around the front end of the car. If the front end grips, he's mega fast. If it's not, he tends to overdrive because he has a little bit of difficulty with turn in understeer. And so, yes, Peter, he had some bad seasons when he came back. Yes, he was getting famous because of his radio antics that were detracting from his driving. But because he was still in F1 and people were seeing him in some bizarre way, I saw more people talking about his prime years than ever before. This is what I'm trying to say. If he had never come back to F1, I swear there'd be fans that still didn't know he drove for McLaren. But because he came back and he became such a figure, I think it prompted people to just look into his career. Look at how many people put up videos of Kimi now on the internet, and they weren't even born when he was driving at his peak. That's because they saw Kimi at the end of the career and they were like, that's an interesting character. I want to see more about him. I want to research more about him. So that's why I say his comeback was good for him overall. But I fully agree with you, Peter, in that he was being recognized more for his non-driving characteristics near the end. And it was clear, it was time to stop in that final season because he was just making uncharacteristic mistakes and he wasn't looking like himself at all. So I agree with that, but I still think it justifies his decision to come back.
Yeah, totally. Good to hear your answers on that. And I'd have to say, for the most part, I agree. I also think, just quickly, I do remember him as well. Like his last season with Ferrari 2018, I think he was just really consistent, which was nice to see. He'd be on the podium. He was third in the standings, I believe, because there's that prize giving ceremony video of him where he's drunk with Vettel that everyone remembers too. But yeah, he was just consistent, and then he had like that really fast lap at Monza where he has no reaction to it. It's like, you've just set the lap record, and he's like, okay. But yeah, he still had his moments, definitely, even in his later career, that I think, like you said, Ciaron, prompted people to check him out, which is a good thing. So yeah, I'd have to agree with you both that I would much rather have Kimi 2012 and onwards than not have Kimi 2012.
Yeah. I feel like he's one of the most iconic drivers. He's been a great ambassador. He was a great ambassador for the sport. I mean, do I think sometimes he could have handled things better? Yes. Are some of his answers a bit, strange? Yes. But overall, I think he was a super talented, super professional driver on the track. And, I think there would be fans even today that would be happy to see him come back. If Kimi Raikkonen announced his comeback tomorrow, I think everyone would be happy. I think most people, some people would be like, what are you doing? But he's such a famous driver. He's such a liked driver that looping this back to the Santander saga, at the end of it all, I do think he came out on top because he's the one that came out with a world title. He's the one that came out with, his fan base intact and the longevity. But it still hurts because those years, and that year in particular in 2008, changed his career forever. I don't know how he could ever forgive a team for doing that. I really don't. Maybe the money made it easier for him. I would have done. So what I would have done is I would have raced for McLaren in 2010 and 11 and 12. And then I would have tried to use that to justify signing for Red Bull right after. And that's what I would have tried to do if I were Kimi. But hindsight is 2020, as they say.
That would have created an interesting alternate timeline because he would have then been competing directly against Lewis.
Yep.
I guess that means Button would have ended up somewhere.
Mercedes. He would have been a Mercedes Button.
Oh, of course, they became Mercedes. Yeah, if we say no Schumacher comeback, then maybe he stays there and he has Rosberg with him.
Well, I think they would have kicked out Nico because Nico was unproven at that time, and they would have kept Jensen. The Michael comeback was happening regardless, I think.
Yeah. And then
so
Nico...
it was Jensen and Michael, and then Nico would have probably gone to Ferrari or something like that. I don't know.
And then if they they would have brought Massa back, and then Alonso, does he end up staying? In a cruel twist of irony, maybe he ends up staying at staying at Renault, and has Petrov as his new teammate. Or there more plausibly would have been Kubica.
Well, okay. So what I think would have happened was that Rosberg would have stayed at Williams in 2010, right? Initially, and then I think Massa would have been dropped earlier, and I really think they would have brought on Alonso and Rosberg. Some people say Kubica would have gone to that seat, but I don't know. I mean, it would have been either Rosberg stays at Williams for an extended time until Michael leaves, and then Rosberg goes to Mercedes in 2013, or Rosberg joins Ferrari early But it's plausible to see that Rosberg would have stayed at Mercedes until 2000. Sorry, Rosberg would have stayed at Williams until 2013. Michael retires. Nico jumps to Mercedes. The question is Jensen still at Mercedes by then? So there's a lot of permutations here.
Yeah, and then when you said about
Yeah.
Kimi trying to go to Red Bull, that messes up their junior program
yeah.
because that then kicks Ricardo out of that seat. Yeah, it creates a lot of knock-on effects.
But what Kimi had to do is to go to McLaren, beat Lewis at least one of those years, and then try to win the title in 2012. Then I think Red Bull couldn't have, because they would have said, "Look, this is one of this how could we turn this guy down? He just won a title in the past 2 years," and I think they would have taken him, or he should have just gone to any other team other than Ferrari. So I couldn't believe it when he re-signed with a team that had Santander as the sponsor, and according to Leo Torini, who is the Ferrari insider, all he wanted was an apology.
They didn't get rid of the Santander sponsorship until 20
Yeah.
as well, so it was there for a long time.
Too passive, too forgiving in my books, anyways.
Yeah.
What about you guys? What do you guys think? Do you think Kimi should have forgiven Ferrari? What do you guys think about that?
I mean, in terms of his career, I suppose actually maybe his hand was more forced than we realize. Because you think about it, he's at Renault for Lotus for 2 years, and Lotus was mostly competitive in 2012, and then from there they kind of never really were able to do that again. So what other options would he have had? McLaren were nowhere in the turbo hybrid era, so he wouldn't have wanted to go there. Obviously, Mercedes seats were full. Red Bull have Ricardo at that point and
Williams.
Kvyat. Yeah, Williams were okay, I suppose. So Williams could have been a shout if he could replace Massa, probably. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like Ferrari is probably the best option. If I was going to choose one of those teams, I'd probably choose Ferrari if even the others were options. So yeah, I think in terms of actually a good move, Ferrari, he probably sort of had to forgive them in order to go there, because it's the most competitive car available to him, which at the end of the day is more important than anything else in F1 to these drivers.
Yeah, I think the same. I mean, maybe obviously it was a good thing he didn't stay with Lotus in the end, because they produced a terrible car. Yeah, that wouldn't have been, because he would have, if he kept, he would have stayed on instead of Maldonado. I mean, who knows where Maldonado overstayed his welcome massively in Formula One. But yeah, otherwise, just kind of locked out of a lot of other good seats, because it's easy to say, oh, he could have gone to Sauber or Caterham, but it's like, yeah, but why? That's just a waste of time. So maybe there was nowhere else to go, and that was the only way that was the only way he could go up, was to go back there. And even with all that baggage, he knows the team, and they know him, and they did have a title together, but everyone still just wants to drive for Ferrari no matter what, which is why it's still, even though, it's still with the Lewis news, unless he knows something we don't, it's like, is he aware of how abominable they've been over the past 10 years, and how they effectively gave him his 2 titles so easily in 2017 and 18, and to a degree 19, by being so useless.
That's why I think he should have gone to McLaren in 2010 to really make his case for Red Bull. I don't think the Lotus stint, I think, okay, there's some history there. They didn't want Kimi because of the driver program, but if he had managed to win a title from 10 to 12, one of those titles somehow, that could have really changed things. Maybe Red Bull would have had second thoughts, Yeah, you're right. His hand was somewhat forced. Final thing I just want to quickly touch on is people wonder, how did Massa hold on to his seat for so long at Ferrari, despite his constant underperforming? And I think our discussion today actually sheds light on that too, because if you think about how important Brazil is to Santander, it explains why Massa was such an important driver for them. And if you think about years like things like the global recession, right, that happened in that time period, that just only increased the importance of Brazil for Santander, because they were looking for new markets to basically compensate, to offset for their losses in Spain. So they couldn't really afford to drop Massa commercially, despite the fact he was driving at a subpar level from 2010 onwards. So I think we've answered a lot of questions today, and I think it really shed light into the commercial angle of Formula One. What a large role it plays.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah, it's one of these strange stories that it's, as we said before, it's surprising it doesn't have more attention, to be honest, because they weren't exactly subtle in hiding what they were doing behind the scenes. But yeah, I think that brings this episode to a close. Yeah, I suppose it's probably, you might struggle to find other podcasts that have covered us. When I put this in my iceberg, I can only find one other video covering it specifically, and obviously there's the aforementioned blog post that link all the press conferences in. But otherwise, it's one a lot of people don't know about, and obviously, as I said before, at the time I didn't know any of this was going on at all.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I made a video on it too a couple months ago, whatever. And there's still like comments that'll occasionally come in and go, "There's no way this happened. This isn't real. You're making this all up. It's not true. Like, why would Ferrari do something so stupid and throw a championship?" Like, it is real. You know, all the sources, all the information is there. There's still people to this day that potentially Alonso fans who don't really want to put his involvement in with this. But yeah, there's still people to this day that don't actually believe it happened when it really did. And it is one of those, like, one of the more crazy stories in F1 that, like you said, Peter, I'm surprised more people don't know about or cover, because yeah, you can get a good title and thumbnail out of it.
If it was any other driver than Kimi, this would have been far more publicized than it is. And I think another angle to this is that so many people are still hurt over 2008 that they don't want to look at the facts, especially fans of Felipe Massa or Fernando Alonso. They just don't want to look at the fact that there are ulterior motives in the sport that dictate results and dictate outcomes. But that's why, fans like us exist, to discuss these things, to bring them to light, to have intelligent discussions about them. So I thoroughly enjoyed discussing this today with both of you, and the listeners enjoyed as well.
So thanks as ever to Ciaron and Dan. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're on Instagram and X at the DRS Train podcast. Make sure to tune in for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.